Architected fresh revenge narrative with conservatorship fraud plot, avoiding all restricted names. Architected fresh revenge narrative with conservatorship fraud plot, avoiding all restricted names. My sister was holding my husband's hand across the table in that courtroom, her thumb moving over his knuckles like she was soothing a child. And when the judge finished reading the petition out loud, she leaned toward me and said, low enough that the bailiff couldn't catch it, sign it over or sit there and let everyone watch you fall apart. She thought that was the worst thing she could say to me. She thought I'd come there with nothing but my hurt feelings and a wrinkled blouse. Behind her, my parents had already moved their chairs an inch closer to her side, the way they always did, the way they'd done my whole life. My father wouldn't look at me. My mother kept her chin up like she was the one being brave. The petitioner's table felt crowded with all the people who were supposed to love me, and I sat alone at mine with a thin blue accordion folder in front of me, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at an office store. They saw that folder and they thought I'd brought it to hide behind. I didn't say anything. I uncapped my pen, set it down, lined it up parallel to the edge of the table, and I waited. People always read my stillness as weakness. I'd stopped correcting them about that a long time ago. Let me back up because none of this makes sense unless you understand the kind of family I grew up in. I was the one who kept the calendar. From the time I was 9 or 10, I was the one who remembered the dentist appointments and the permission slips and which casserole dish belonged to which neighbor. My younger sister was the one who got remembered. There's a difference, and if you grew up in a house like mine, you already know exactly what I mean. Shelby cried beautifully. That sounds cruel, so let me explain it. When Shelby cried, the whole house reorganized itself around the crying. My mother would drop whatever she was doing and gather her up. My father would put down the paper. And somehow, always, the conversation would end with everyone looking at me because I was the one who'd upset her, or hadn't included her, or had been too sharp, too fast, too much. Can't you go a little easier on your sister? My father must have said that to me 1,000 times. I got so used to it that I started saying it to myself. Go easier. Make less noise, clean it up before anyone has to see it. So I built a life out of order, because order was the one thing in my world that behaved. I became an accountant, a boring word for a job I genuinely loved, because numbers don't change their story when you turn your back. I had my own small practice by 30, a tidy apartment, a standing Saturday coffee at the place on the corner where the owner knew my order. I liked Sundays. I liked closing the laptop at 6. People mistook that for being cold. My ex-husband mistook it on purpose. Travis came into my life when I was 28, and for a while I thought he was the proof that a steady person could be loved for being steady. You make the floor feel solid, he told me once, early on, and I held on to that for years. I didn't understand yet that a man can love the ground he's standing on right up until the day he decides to dig through it. The other thing you need to know is the house. My grandmother, my mother's mother, raised me more than she'd ever admit out loud, because admitting it would have meant saying something true about my mother, and our family didn't do that. Gran had a narrow 2-story place on a street lined with old maples, plus a little brokerage account she'd built up over 40 years of being the only woman at her bank who never made a mistake. When she got sick, she did something nobody expected. She left all of it to me, not split between her daughter and her grandchildren, to me. She told me why near the end, in a voice that had gone thin but not soft. Because you're the only one who never asked me for anything, she said, and because you'll keep it instead of bleeding it. I keep coming back to that word, bleeding. The first sign I missed was perfume in my own bathroom, not mine. I told myself my sister had used it when she stopped by, even though I couldn't remember her stopping by. Then there were the late nights, Travis coming home with that particular brightness that I now recognize as guilt wearing the mask of energy. Then a phone that started living face down on the counter. I'm an accountant. I notice when a column doesn't add up. I want you to understand that I noticed. I just couldn't make myself believe what the numbers were telling me because the answer required me to know my own sister. She announced the pregnancy at a family dinner. She cried, of course. My mother had her wrapped up before the sentence was finished. And Travis, my husband, stood behind her chair with his hand on her shoulder, and in the half-second before I made myself stop looking, I saw his thumb move over her collarbone in a way that was not a brother-in-law's hand. Nobody looked at me. That's the detail I can't shake even now. There was a baby coming into the family, and not one person at that table turned to see how I was taking it, because on some level, they had all already decided I was no longer a person whose reaction mattered. I didn't scream. I want to tell you I flipped the table, said something that ended up on a coffee mug. I didn't. I drove home, sat in my car in the parking garage for 40 minutes, and then I went upstairs and made tea, and the tea went cold, and I watched the steam stop rising. That was the night I stopped being asleep. The campaign started about 3 weeks later, and it was sophisticated enough that I almost admire it now, the way you'd admire a clean robbery. It began with concern. My mother started calling more, but the calls weren't about me. They were reports about how fragile my sister was, how the pregnancy was hard on her, how she needed everyone's support. Then the calls developed a second layer. "Have you been sleeping?" my mother would ask in a tone that had decided the answer before I spoke. "Travis says you've seemed off." Travis says. He never once told me to my face that he thought I was unwell. He was far too good for that. He built it in the negative space. "She's been under a lot of pressure," he'd say to my parents, knowing I was in the next room. "She lost her grandmother, and I think the estate, all of it. It's a lot for one person to manage. I worry she's not herself." He said it the way you set a trap, gently, so the spring doesn't show. My sister did the loud work. She told my mother I'd had a meltdown at a client's office. I had not. She said I'd forgotten to pay Grant's property taxes and almost lost the house. I had paid them early, like I pay everything. She told a cousin I'd been seen crying in a parking lot in the middle of the day, on an afternoon I could prove I'd spent in a closing meeting 2 cities over. None of it was true. But truth, I was learning, is not a fact in a family. It's a vote, and I had already lost the vote before I knew there was one. I understood what they were building the day the envelope came. It was a manila envelope, hand-delivered, left with the doorman. A petition for conservatorship. They were asking a court to declare that I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs, my person and my estate, and to appoint a conservator to handle my finances and my decisions for me. The proposed conservator was my mother. The supporting declarations came from my husband and my sister. The grounds were a tidy little narrative of instability, grief, and erratic behavior, with my own steadiness twisted into evidence of the opposite. "See how rigid she's become. See how she isolates. See how obsessed she is with the house and the money." The house. There it was. They didn't want me committed to anything. They wanted the accounts. They wanted Grant's house. A conservator controls the estate, and a conservator who is my mother would not say no to a daughter who needed help raising a baby, would she? It was elegant. They had found the one legal door that let them take everything I owned while wearing the face of people who only wanted to take care of me. I drove to my parents' house that night, still holding some stupid, childish hope. I thought if I put the petition in their hands, they'd be horrified. I thought my father would stand up. Instead, my parents stood together in their living room with the lamps on low and their faces already set, and my father said, "You're stable enough financially that you can help, Marin. We don't understand why you're fighting this." My mother folded her arms. "It's not the baby's fault. You'd really let a baby go without so you can sit on your grandmother's money?" And then my sister stepped out of the kitchen. She'd been there the whole time, of course she had, with one hand resting on the small curve of her stomach. "We're trying to build a family," she said, soft as anything. "You can be part of it, or you can step aside." That was the first time I heard the line. Sign it over or step aside. She'd later say a sharper version of it in the courtroom, but she rehearsed it that night in my parents' living room, and I watched the 3 of them watch me to see if I'd break. I didn't. Something happened instead that I didn't have a word for at the time. It wasn't anger, not the hot kind. It was the feeling you get when you've been doing long division and the remainder finally comes out clean. Everything just clicked into a number. "Okay," I said. That was all. My mother looked almost disappointed, that she'd wanted a scene she could describe later. I picked up my keys and I left, and as I walked to my car, I realized I'd been gripping the petition so hard it had a fold down the middle that wouldn't come out. Here's what they didn't know about me. They thought the conservatorship would be easy because they'd never actually watched me work. They'd watched me clean up, sweep glass, smooth things over. They'd never seen me build a case. But building a case is just accounting with people instead of dollars. You gather the documents, you match the dates, you find the place where the story they're telling contradicts the evidence they left lying around, and you do not say a word until you have all of it. I went home that night and I did not cry on the floor. I'd cried enough already, weeks ago in a parking garage. I made coffee at 10 at night, opened my laptop, and I started building. I started with the easy things, the things they'd been too arrogant to hide. My sister and my husband texted each other constantly, and at some point Travis had connected his phone to the iPad that still synced to our shared family account, the one I'd set up years ago when he'd forgotten existed because he'd never been the one to manage anything. Months of messages came down in a clean, cold waterfall. I read them with a detachment of someone reconciling a bank statement. There were the obvious ones, the ones that confirmed the affair down to dates and hotel names. But those weren't what made my hands go still. It was the planning. There was a thread from 6 weeks back. My sister, Mom's on board now. She thinks Marin can't handle the estate. Travis, good. Keep that going. The doctor stuff is what'll sell it to the judge. My sister, once your mother-in-law's the conservator, we just ask her for what we need. She won't say no to a baby. And then the one I printed 3 copies of, the one I'd lie awake thinking about. Travis again. Just keep saying she's unstable. If she stays calm in court, that actually helps us. It'll look like she's hiding how bad it is. They had decided that my composure itself was proof of my illness. There was no version of me in their story that wasn't sick. If I cried, I was unstable. If I stayed calm, I was concealing how unstable I was. They had built a room with no door. So I built my own. Around midnight, there was a knock, and it was Mrs. Salcedo from across the hall, who is 70-something and has decided that I don't eat enough. She had a foil-covered plate. We stood in my doorway and talked about nothing, the weather, her grandson, and then she paused the way people do right before they say the real thing. I didn't want to be in your business, she said. But your husband, I'd see his car at your sister's place all the time this past year, afternoons. I figured you all were just close. She studied my face. You didn't know. I know now, I said. She reached out and squeezed my arm with a hand that felt like a sparrow, and she said she'd write down anything I needed. Dates, times, whatever. She had it all in her little book, because she watched the street and didn't sleep much anymore. The neighbors had seen the truth a year before my own parents would admit it. I thanked her, took the plate I wouldn't eat, and went back to the table. By 2 a.m, I had a spine for the whole thing. There was the financial record, and this was the part that turned the case from defense to offense. I pulled Grand's brokerage statements, and then, because I'm thorough, I pulled the joint account Travis and I still hadn't closed. Over the previous 4 months, he'd moved just under $11,000 out of it, in small, careful increments, into an account I didn't recognize. I traced it. It went to my sister. They had already started spending the money the court hadn't given them yet. People who are confident they're going to win get sloppy early. And then I did the thing they would never in 100 years have predicted. I called my doctor and asked for a referral, and within the week I sat for a full neuropsychological evaluation with a forensic specialist, the exact kind of independent assessment a court weighs in a conservatorship case. I answered every question. I did the memory tasks and the reasoning tasks and the long, boring inventories. And Dr. Reyes wrote a report, signed and dated, stating in clear clinical language that I showed no cognitive impairment, no mood or thought disorder, and full capacity to manage my own person and estate. They had built their entire case on the claim that I couldn't be trusted to run my own life. I went out and got a forensic psychologist to put her license behind the opposite. The last thing I did was the simplest. There was a recording. The night my sister and parents had stood in that living room and told me to sign it over or step aside, my phone had been in my coat pocket, and my phone records calls when I tell it to, and I'd told it to in the car on the way over because some part of me already knew. The audio was clear, my mother's voice, my sister's voice, soft and triumphant. The line, The whole architecture of it, in their own words, freely given because they were so sure they'd already won. I bought a second blue accordion folder because the first one filled up. I labeled the tabs, I made copies, and when I closed it the last time, around 4 a.m. with the sky going gray, I felt the thing I'd been chasing my whole life without a name for it. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was the quiet that comes when the books finally balance. The story was mine now. I just hadn't read it to them yet. The hearing was on a Tuesday. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old radiators. My attorney was a calm woman named Ms. O'Coffer, who'd looked at my folder in our first meeting, gone quiet for a long time, and then said, "You did the work. I'm mostly going to stay out of your way." I'd wanted it that way. I needed to be the one who spoke. They were already at the petitioner's table when I came in. My sister had dressed for sympathy, a soft cardigan over the bump, her hand resting on it the whole time so the judge couldn't miss it. Travis sat beside her in a tie I'd bought him. My parents were in the row behind, leaning forward like they could physically prop up the story with their shoulders. When my sister saw me, her face did that tightening thing, the smug little cinch at the corners. She thought she was watching me walk to my own funeral. We rose for Judge Brennan, an older woman with reading glasses on a chain and a way of looking over them that made the whole room sit up straighter. Their attorney went first. Miss Holloway had a smooth voice built for exactly this. She talked about a grieving woman overwhelmed by a sudden inheritance, exhibiting concerning behavior, isolating from a loving family who only wanted to ensure she and her late grandmother's estate were protected. She used the word protected, the way a hand closes around a wrist. She submitted my husband's declaration. She submitted my sister's. She gestured, gently, at the pregnant woman beside her, and let the image do its work. Then my sister stood, because she couldn't help herself, and addressed the judge directly, with that trembling lower lip she'd been perfecting since she was 4. "I love my sister," she said. "We all do. That's why this is so hard. She used to be the responsible one. We just want to make sure she's safe." She turned and looked at me when she said it, and under the part the judge could hear she mouthed 2 words, and the 2 words were the line. "Step aside." "Miss Calder," Judge Brennan said, "do you wish to respond?" This was the moment they built the whole thing around, the moment the quiet sister was supposed to either weep or apologize, and either way confirm she couldn't be trusted to speak for herself. My mother actually leaned forward. I think she wanted to watch. I stood. I picked up the folder. And before I opened it, I looked at my sister, and I did the only thing I planned in advance to do, the one small thing I promised myself in the car at 4 a.m. I smiled at her. Not big. Just enough that she'd know I wasn't afraid. Her face flickered. Just for a second, the performance slipped, and something underneath showed through, and it was not concern. It was calculation, suddenly uncertain of its math. "Your Honor," I said, "I'd like to start by addressing the claim that I'm not competent to manage my own affairs." I handed Dr. Reyes's report to the bailiff, who passed it up. "This is a forensic neuropsychological evaluation completed 3 weeks ago by a court-qualified specialist. It concludes that I have full cognitive capacity and no impairment of any kind." The petitioners built their case on the opposite claim. I'd asked the court to weigh a licensed forensic assessment against the unsupported impressions of the man I'm divorcing and the sister who's carrying his child. The room moved. You could feel it. Ms. Holloway started to rise, and the judge lifted one finger and she sat back down. "I'd like to address that last point since I just made it," I said, and I laid down the next pages. "These are paternity records and clinic appointment confirmations establishing that my husband is the father of my sister's child. I mention it not for drama. I mention it because the 2 people declaring that I'm too unstable to handle my own money have a direct financial interest in a court handing that money to my mother, who has stated to me that she would use it to support their child. I let that sit. The petition isn't about my health. It's a collection action dressed up as concern." My father made a sound in the back of his throat. My mother had gone very still. "Here," I said, and laid down the bank records, "is a transfer history from a joint account my husband and I have not yet closed. Over the last 4 months, he moved nearly $11,000 out of it, in increments, into an account belonging to my sister. They started spending money the court hadn't awarded them. I have the full trace if the court wants it. Travis came halfway out of his chair. Those are out of context. Sit down, sir, Judge Brennan said without raising her voice, and he sat. I didn't look at him. I'd promised myself I wouldn't. I laid down Mrs. Salcedo's signed statement, dates and times of a married man's car parked outside his pregnant girlfriend's apartment, going back more than a year. I laid down the printed texts, and I read 3 of them into the record. Flat and clear. No theater. The one where my mother was confirmed on board. The one where they agreed the doctor stuff would sell it to the judge. And then the last one, and I read it slowly because it was the one that undid them. Just keep saying she's unstable, I read. If she stays calm in court, that actually helps us. It'll look like she's hiding how bad it is. I set the page down and looked up at the judge. They decided in advance that my composure would be used as evidence against me. I'd asked the court to notice that I've stayed composed this entire hearing and to consider what that's supposed to prove. For the first time, Judge Brennan looked at the petitioner's table over the top of her glasses for a long, long moment. And this, I said, and I set the last thing down, is a recording with a transcript of a conversation at my parents' home where my sister told me to sign over my grandmother's estate or step aside, and my mother agreed, in their own voices, freely given. I think they assumed I'd never play it for anyone. I sat down, I lined my pen up parallel to the edge of the table, and I folded my hands. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the radiator ticking. Judge Brennan read for what felt like a year. Then she took off her glasses and let them hang on the chain, and she addressed the petitioner's table in a voice that had gone cold and formal. The petition for conservatorship is denied, she said. It is denied with prejudice. I find no credible evidence of incapacity and substantial evidence that this petition was filed in bad faith for the purpose of obtaining control of the respondent's assets. She turned to Ms. Holloway. Counsel, I'm referring this matter for review of the declaration submitted under penalty of perjury. And I'm noting the financial transfers described today for the appropriate authorities. This court does not exist to help people steal from their own family while pretending to save them. That was when it happened, to collapse. My sister made a sound I'd never heard her make, not the pretty crying she'd built a life on, but something raw, an ugly choking noise that came out before she could shape it into anything. My mother was on her feet saying the judge didn't understand. My father had his head in his hands. Travis kept saying my name like it was a thing that could still help him. They'd gone white, all of them, the blood just dropping out of their faces, and then the sounds they made stopped being words. The bailiff was already moving toward them. There was nothing left to manage, not for them, not anymore. I closed my folder. The little snap of the elastic was the only neat sound in the room. I stood, smoothed my blazer, and I walked out, and I did not look back because I didn't need to. I already knew how the story ended. I'd written it at 4 a.m. at my kitchen table, and now it was just being read aloud. The air outside was cool and a little wet, the maples along the courthouse lawn already letting go of their first leaves. I could hear, faintly, behind the heavy doors, my mother's voice still going, still insisting. I let the doors close on it. I walked down the steps slowly, one at a time, feeling each one, and somewhere around the bottom step I noticed I wasn't holding my breath anymore. I couldn't remember when I'd started holding it. Years, maybe. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. It was my mother. 3 words. We didn't know. I read it standing on the sidewalk, and I felt the old reflex stir, the one that had run my whole life, the one that said go easier, smooth it over, clean it up before anyone has to see. I put the phone back in my pocket without answering. Some messages don't deserve a reply, and some people, when they tell you they didn't know, are really telling you they decided not to. I thought about my grandmother, about the word she'd used. Bleeding. You'll keep it instead of bleeding it. She'd seen them all clearly long before I had, and she'd handed me the one thing she knew they couldn't be trusted with, and she'd been right, and I wished more than anything I could call her and tell her so. At the corner, I waited for the light, even though there were no cars, because I'm the kind of person who waits for the light. A woman with a stroller waited beside me. The signal changed, and as I stepped off the curb, I understood that I wasn't walking away from them at all. I'd done that already, Years ago, in a parking garage, in a courtroom, in 1,000 quiet moments where I cleaned up a mess that was never mine. What I was doing now was different. I was walking back, finally, all the way back, to the only person who'd been waiting for me the whole time. I went home. I made coffee. I drank it hot. For a long time, I believed that being good meant being quiet, that if I cleaned up enough messes, forgave enough slights, made myself small enough, my family would finally turn around and see me. What I learned in that courtroom is that quietness without a spine isn't goodness at all. It's just permission. Every time I went easier on Shelby, every time I swept up the glass and apologized for the noise it made, I was teaching the people around me that my needs could be moved to the back of the line. They didn't betray me overnight. They betrayed me one small allowance at a time, and I had handed them the pencil. The thing that saved me wasn't rage. Rage would have given them exactly the unstable woman they'd written into their story. What saved me was the slow, unglamorous work of paying attention, pulling the bank records, matching the dates, sitting through a forensic evaluation, listening to Mrs. Parham. Salcedo's quiet account of a car parked where it shouldn't have been. Travis and Shelby thought my calm was a weakness they could exploit. They never understood that a clear head is a kind of weapon, and that the person who keeps the receipts is rarely the person who loses. They built their whole case on the idea that I couldn't think straight. They lost because I could. But knowing the truth and being willing to use it are two different things, and the gap between them is filled with nerve. There were nights at that kitchen table when it would have been so much easier to sign the papers, to keep the peace, to be the agreeable sister one last time. The hardest thing I ever did was not the research. It was deciding I was worth defending. It was walking into that room alone and letting them underestimate me one final time, and then refusing to flinch when it counted. My grandmother saw all of this before I did. She handed me the house not because I was the richest or the loudest, but because I was the one who would protect a thing instead of bleeding it dry. She trusted me with something real, and for years I almost proved her wrong by failing to protect the most important thing she'd left in my care, which was me. I think about her every time I wait at a crosswalk with no cars coming. She'd have liked that I waited. She'd have liked even more that I finally stopped waiting for people who were never going to choose me. If you take anything from what happened to me, let it be this. Be kind, but keep your eyes open. Stay calm, but keep your records. And when the moment comes to stand up for yourself, do it even if your voice shakes, even if the only person in your corner is the one you've ignored the longest. The day I stopped cleaning up after everyone else was the day I finally had hands free enough to hold on to my own life. I drink my coffee hot now. I let it stay that way.